As the kids leave, I'm going to start by talking about a boyhood hero. Hero, I don't know, maybe an intrigue. Do you know the name Evel Knievel? Yeah, some of you laugh. So it sounds like the older part of our congregation gets that. If you grew up in the 60s or the 70s, you know who Evel Knievel was. Evel Knievel was this crazy kind of a guy who did amazing stunts on motorcycles. I had a lunchbox, an Evel Knievel lunchbox. I also had the Evel Knievel toy, where you could race him on his motorcycle and do flips and all kinds of cool stuff. And I wish I kept them because they're both the lunchbox is over $300 and the toy is over $500. So keep those toys, people. Keep your toys because eventually they'll be worth some money. At least you can hand them off to your grandkids and they might be able to sell them for a boatload of dollars. But Evel Knievel, evil, not E-V-I-L, but evil, E-V-E-L. And he got his name because as a young kid, he used to steal hubcaps off of cars and then steal motorcycles. When he was 13, he stole a Harley Davidson, and he got caught so many times by the police that they called him Evel Knievel. He was born with the name Robert Craig Knievel, but later changed his name to Evel, E-V-E-L, which rhymes with Knievel. It's the last four letters in his last name. He took that name for his stunts. He was a stunt performer. He dropped out of high school, went to work in the copper mines in Butte, Montana, and then found his way working in a motorcycle shop. And it was to promote the motorcycle shop and to make some sales that he organized a stunt event. And it was his first stunt that he did, and he jumped over a box of rattlesnakes and a tethered mountain lion. He was not totally successful as he landed on top of the snakes and busted them free, but so began his career. He did all kinds of astounding jumps. In 1967, he jumped over the fountains at Caesar Palace in Las Vegas. In 1973, he jumped over 50 cars in the Los Angeles Coliseum. He went across the ocean over to London. He jumped 13 buses in 1975. 13 buses lined up, end to end. It's over about 2 football fields. So picture that, guys, as you're watching football today. 2 football fields. He's in the air, soaring over all this stuff. His most famous stunt was his attempt to jump the Snake River Canyon. Most people think of that as the Grand Canyon. He had this rocket-powered engine that would launch his motorcycle. He was unsuccessful in that attempt, too. But he was incredibly successful. He did over 300 crazy kinds of jumps. And most people thought, this guy is risky. He's crazy. He does all kinds of crazy stuff. But to his credit, he was calculated. He always had a plan. So because he was a stunt performer, he wanted to bring together the crowds. He wore his star-spangled outfit, and he had this flowing cape that went with it. But he wanted to perform, so he'd do these crazy things. But he was calculated in his planning of that. So he would go to the exact location. He would be aware of the wind. He would measure out the distances. He worked with his jump team and the actual building of the ramps to make sure it was the right pitch to get him enough air, and then the right landing on the other side as he would come down. So it's not like he was just careless. He was cautious and careful as he put together a strategic plan. However, as I mentioned, he wasn't always successful. So in his 300 jumps, 19 of them he failed. He's often noted for bragging about breaking every bone in his body. The Guinness Book of World Records says that he broke 433 bones. One of them was his skull, and he ended up unconscious and in a coma for a month. So this is Evel Knievel. This is what he did. And as a performer, he was intriguing and fun to watch, especially as a kid. And some people would say the guy was crazy. He took way too much of a risk. But if you actually run the numbers, and 19 failures over 300 jumps, it comes out to 94% of the time he was successful. Now, of course, the 6% of the time he was unsuccessful was quite painful, as you see one of the images there of him crashing. But here's the deal. Evel Knievel was a performer, and Evel Knievel loved motorcycles. And so he was willing to take a calculated risk in order to do what he loved to do. And the reality is, when you kind of think about his story and what motivated him, there's a principle there that is true for all of us in life. And I rate it like this. Nothing happens, I have a slide for it, go to the next slide. Nothing happens unless we make something happen. Right? Nothing happens unless we actually make something happen. And yet when we make something happen, there's no guarantee that the outcome will be successful. I mean, you kind of think about this in life, right? It's true. Nothing happens unless I do something. I have to act. I have to make a decision. But sometimes we're paralyzed and we don't act because the decision is daunting and it seems incredibly risky. And it is wise to pause and to put together a plan before we make that decision. But in the end of the day, we have to do something. That's just the way life is. Nothing happens unless we do something. And the reality is we never know the outcome until we actually take the risk, get on the motorcycle, rev it up, go down the ramp, and launched into the air and hit the ground on the other side. Do we know whether we're successful or we fail? That's life. Some of you are high school students right now, and in front of you is like your whole life. It's kind of fun and comfortable to be at home, except you're at that age where right now it's like you want to get out as much as you can, so you hang out with your friends and get out of the house as much as you can. That's pretty normal. Your parents did the same thing. They're having a hard time with it, but they did the same thing. But the scary part about being a high school senior is that you got to make a choice. What am I going to do when I get done with high school? And do I move out? Do I go to college? And then you have this big decision of what kind of career is it? What will I study in college? And you may feel a little paralyzed right now. You may feel like this is a big risk. What do I do? And the reality is, you're going to make a decision. It's going to be a risk, and you're not going to know the outcome. And neither did your parents until they took the risk and they moved forward. Take your parents. Here's another example, right? As an adult, do you marry or not marry? That's a pretty big decision. And who do you marry? And as you begin to find interest in somebody else, or maybe you show no interest in others, and you choose the life of being single, that's like maybe a risky choice. Or you choose to commit yourself to somebody and to get married, and that is a risky choice, because what does that mean moving forward, and how's it going to go? The parents who choose to get married and then decide to have kids, again, another risk. Like you don't know what the outcome's going to be. You don't know how you as a mom don't know what that's going to do to your body. You don't know the any kind of developmental challenges that might be with the child. You don't know if you'll lose the child. You don't know. And then if you do have the child and the child grows up, you don't know when they leave. Will they continue to espouse your values, or will they go in a completely different direction? It's a risk. We can just go on and on and on and talking about how life is like this. It just is. Most of the time we don't live too much, very conscious of it, or paying too much attention to it, but it just is true, right? Nothing happens in life until we make something happen in life, and it's risky when we do it, and we just don't know if we're going to be successful or unsuccessful in it. But in the end of the day, we have to make a choice. Now, we're studying on Sundays the book of Esther. And the title of this series is Esther, the hiddenness yet presentness of God. And we're continuously reminded that even though we don't find God mentioned in the book, that his presence is evident behind the scenes. And maybe another verse that will go with today's lesson that we will see from the life of Esther and Haman from chapter 5, if you have your Bible, you can turn there right now, is this. Proverbs chapter 16, verse 5 says that a man plans his course. A man plans his course. A man makes a decision. A man calculates the risks. He doesn't know what will the successful or unsuccessful the outcome will be, but he plans out his course. And then the next part of the verse says, but God directs his steps. God directs his steps. The hiddenness yet presentness of God in everything in our life. We're going to see that principle and that idea so clearly evident in Esther chapter 5 today. And from Esther chapter 5, we will learn about maybe some important principles that should be at play as we take these risks in life and make these decisions. And so if you have a Bible, I invite you to join along as we read through Esther chapter 5. I'm going to read through the whole text this morning, and we'll come back and we'll make some comments and dig into and reflect on it. And so the context, again, remember the story just simply is that there's a king, Xerxes, Persian king, all-powerful. He has a queen, Vashti. He gets rid of Vashti. Esther, he selects in place of her. Esther, significantly, is a Jew. And in chapter 3, introduced a new character, Haman. Haman, introduced another character, Mordecai, because Mordecai doesn't honor Haman. Haman's been honored by Xerxes, the king, into the highest position. But because Mordecai, Esther's cousin, who raised her when she was orphaned, Haman doesn't like Mordecai because Mordecai won't honor him. As a result, Mordecai convinces the king to issue an edict to destroy all Jews, to have them killed. And last week, we learned that Mordecai suggested to Esther, who was in this position of being the queen, perhaps, this time, you are in this position for this time, for such a time as this. And she, at the end of what we read last week, says, okay, I'll go do this even though it's against the law to go and approach the king, but I'll do this, pray for me. And then she ends with this phrase, if I perish, I perish. If I perish, I perish. If I perish, I perish. That is where we ended the story last week. And today we begin. It's now the third day. She said, pray and fast for 3 days. It's now the third day. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes, and she stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall, and he was facing the entrance. And when he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out to her the gold scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and she touched the tip of the scepter. Then the king asked, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be given to you." Now, what scholars would say about this is it's not literally half the kingdom. It's just it's a hyperbole. It's a way of saying, look, I'm going to be incredibly favorable towards your request if it's reasonable. What is your request? And then this is how Esther answers. She says, "If it pleases the king," replied Esther, "let the king come together with Haman. Come today to a banquet that I have prepared for him." "Bring Haman at once," the king said, "so that we may do what Esther asks." So the king and Haman went to the banquet Esther had prepared. And as they were drinking wine, Remember that, right? Drinking wine. This is a big part of the Persian Empire and the way they make decisions and go about doing business. As they were drinking wine, the king asked Esther, "Now, what is your petition? It will be given to you. And what is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted." Now, Esther replied, "My petition and my request is this: if the king regards me with favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, then let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet that I will prepare for them. And then I will answer the king's question." Now Haman went out that day and happy and in high spirits. But when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor showed any fear in his presence, he was filled with rage against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and he went home. Now, calling together his friends and Zeresh, his wife, Haman boasted to them. He boasted to them about his wealth, about his many sons, and all the ways that the king had honored him, and how he had been elevated above all the other nobles and officials. And then he added this, "And that's not all. If I am the only person that Queen Esther invited to accompany the king to the banquet that she gave. And she has invited me along with the king tomorrow. But all this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see the Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate." You can just hear the tone in his voice and just the whole change. And his wife Zeresh and all of his friends said to him, "Have a gallows built 75 feet high." That's pretty tall. "And ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai hanged on it. Then go with the king to the dinner and be happy." This suggestion delighted Haman, and he had gallows built. End of chapter 5. Wow, there's a lot that's taking place here. And again, chapter 5 ends much like chapter 4. You get a little bit of the story, and there's all kinds of interesting details, and then it ends. What's going to happen next? And again, we don't know what's going to happen next. So we're just going to talk about what happens in chapter 5 today, remembering all this happened in chapter 1, 2, 3, and 4. As you consider the way that the author puts this together, everything comes in twos. So there's two parts to this story, right? Verses 1 through verse 8, and then verse 9 through verse 14. And these two parts are built around the two main characters of chapter 5, and that is Esther and Haman. And these two parts with these two characters are built around the two problems that both of these characters have. Esther's problem, of course, is life-threatening. She will die. Mordecai's problem, on the other hand, is that he wants to kill Mordecai because he will not bow to Haman. And then lastly, what we see is two plans. There's two plans. There's Haman's plan and there's Esther's plan. And for both of them, there's a great risk in their plan. Now, all we see in chapter 5 and all that we know about these two characters is that Esther's plan is much riskier than Haman's plan. But we'll find out next week how risky Haman's plan actually is. For the rest of our time, I just want to dig into these two plans and reflect on Esther's plan and reflect on Haman's plan and compare them because they are both making a decision, right? Unless they do something, then nothing is going to happen. And their action to do something is going to prove to be, and it is for Esther, incredibly risky, and it's going to prove to be very risky for Haman as well. And so let's just look at their plans. If you begin in verse 1, we start with Esther's plan. She's in the first part, right? Esther's plan. It's very interesting that the writer begins on the third day, Esther puts on her royal robes. She puts on her royal robe. So apparently, in those 3 days while she was praying and fasting, she did more than pray and fast. She also contemplated and put together a plan. Her plan began with the way that she was going to dress her royal robes. Now, remember that the introduction to Esther in the story, way back in chapter 2, was around Esther being selected, dragged out of her home, captured in essence, and put into the king's harem. Beauty treatments, and then she was finally selected to spend an evening with the king. And all around that decision to go before the king, she did her beauty treatments, and then she was permitted to select whatever dress that she wanted to select, as well as to take along any accessory that would make the outfit look that extra special. And here we find Esther doing the same kind of thing. You can imagine perhaps that she consults the same eunuch who she found favor with way back many years ago to say, hey, you got any thoughts on how do I approach the king in this situation? After all, Esther knows, think about this. Think about this. Esther understands that she's about to walk into the presence of the king. And before she can get the king to say anything about her request or to be willing to listen to her request, she has to get the king to be favorable towards her, because the law says if she approaches the king, she can be killed. The only thing she's got at this point is visual. That's it. It's what the king will see, and what the king sees and how he responds based on what he sees is going to enable her to take another step further in her plan to make the request. And so it's with great detail that she goes through this, and she thinks through what is it she's going to wear before she approaches the king. Now, in some ways, it's a lot like a wedding. I mean, think of these brides, right? Do up their hair, get it all pulled back and leave a couple curls down the side, put on the pretty makeup, the little blue eyeshadow and eyeliner to kind of pull out the blue in the suit of the groom, right? The elegant earrings and the necklace that's just perfectly selected. And then, of course, the dress. Oh, that big, flowing, expensive, very expensive dress. Right? And a bride goes through great lengths to prepare herself for that day when she is going to stand before her groom. She doesn't just come carelessly. She comes with great thought. And we see the same here with Esther. Esther knows that she's got to capture the king's heart before she can win his ears and his mind to be able to make her request. And so her dress is with great dignity. The second thing that we see about Esther's plan is that she stands in the inner court. So that's significant. Her approach to the king is not to just barge in, but her approach is one of humility. She comes, she stands before the king and waits for the king to respond to her. She doesn't make a scene. She doesn't go barging in. She doesn't say, I'm the queen, I have direct access, I can do whatever it is that I wish and I want. No, she understands the rules, and so she stands and she awaits the king's invitation for her to move forward. Now, this is a pretty wise choice on Esther's part. Those of us who are, and I say those of us because I am one of, those of us who are type A personality, firstborn, D on the disc profile, those who are dominant and direct, those of us who we have this personality. I mean, this is how God wires us. We instinctively, when we see a problem, we make a plan, we launch into action. And sometimes, too many times in my life, it has been too quickly. and I end up blundering my way through things because of what I said or how I acted, and it was too fast, and it was a mistake. Esther here doesn't behave like that. She stands and she waits. We also see this humble approach in what she does next. We see that she wins the king's favor, and the king then extends the gold scepter to her. And so she approaches the king, and it would be this big, long runway that she's walking down. The hall has been uncovered. We can actually go there to this day and do Esther's walk to the throne room of the king. Crazy how history can be preserved. But this would be a very long walk for her. And she walks up to the king who has his scepter, and she touches the end of it. She follows the protocol. Now, she could have said, "This is dumb. I don't like these rules. Why do I need to humiliate myself and bow before the king?" But she doesn't. Instead, she submits, which is actually a biblical character. It is a righteous characteristic described in the Bible. And so we find things like how important it is that we submit to our governing officials, how important it is that we submit to one another. So Romans 13, submit to your governing officials, submit to one another. Ephesians chapter 5, just before Paul admonishes wives to submit to their husbands, and husbands to love their wives, laying down their life, submitting to their wife. This idea of submission, this attitude of submission is not a weak character. It's actually a strong character quality. Jesus is described as being one who came gently and humbly riding on a donkey. God is humble. Esther's plan, we see, begins to work. Her dress in dignity, her approach in humility works. It's interesting the way that the writer describes the king's response. The king who's sitting on his royal throne in the hall is pleased with her. It's the exact same phrase that the narrator used when he described Esther being selected by the king amongst all the other women that were brought to him. She found favor with him. She found favor with him. She took a great risk. She put together a plan. She didn't know how the plan would work out. The law said she would die, but she knew that if she didn't take the risk, she would die anyways. And perhaps by taking the risk, the outcome would be positive. Two parts of her plan work. And it moves now on to the third piece of her plan. The third part is to now make the request. And this part in the story gets to be so intriguing. It's like, what all are you thinking, Esther? What's going on here? Because as she approaches, the king says, "What is it that you want? Up to half of my kingdom." And this is her moment, right? She's won favor with the king. Now she can spill the beans. She can say, "Hey, look, this dirty old man that you have appointed to a high position, this Haman, he's an evil guy, and he's about destroying me and my people, and you need to know that I am a Jew." This, after all, is the request. But she doesn't ask for that. Instead, she asks the king to come to a banquet. So her request is subtle. Actually, as we read all the way through this chapter, we don't even come to what it is that Esther requests. Instead, we find that she invites the king to come to the banquet. He comes to the banquet. He asks again. It's not until the king asks 3 times later that we will find out what Esther's request is. And as you read this, you begin to wonder. I've wondered so often, like, what's wrong? Did she get chicken? Right? You just get cold feet. Like, what's the deal? Like, she's standing in front of the king, and now she's just way too nervous. She can't get the words out. And then eventually she says, well, why don't you just come to a banquet? And then they're at dinner, and they're drinking wine. He's in good spirits. I mean, you want to talk to somebody about making a poor decision, talk to them when they're not sober, right? That just seems like the prime time. Did she get chicken again? I don't think so. I don't think so at all. That's not at all what's going on. Esther is calculating. She understands that curiosity will kill the cat, right? And in this case, curiosity will win the king. And that's her approach. Her approach is to lead him on, to get him to come towards her. She doesn't have to go to him to get him to say yes. Anybody in sales knows this, right? You got to get the customer to say yes at least 7 times. So they ask, like anytime you go to buy a car, right? The salesman's going to ask you 7 different questions. He's going to ask you, oh, how you feeling today? Today's a great day. Don't you love the weather? And it's a beautiful sunny day. Oh, yes. Got 1 down. All right, and he's going to ask, sorry, those of you guys who are in sales, I'm not calling you out here. I'm just saying, right? This is true about who we are as people. If you can get people coming towards you, then it's a lot easier to get them to say yes. And so this is what's going on with Esther. And that's the end of part 1 of the story. No, there's nothing else that happens. That's it. Part 2, we move to Haman. And Haman's got a plan too. His plan is to build gallows 75 feet high. Think about 75 feet, right? If I'm 6 feet, so that would be 10, 11 of me tall. That's a lot. That's pretty high. All right? Build this big, impressive gallows. And then have Mordecai hung on those gallows. Go talk to the king and ask the king to do this for you. Right? So this is his plan. Now, what's very important to note in the text is how it is that he develops his plan. What kind of character is there in Haman that leads him to the decision for this plan? Well, the first thing that we see is that Haman is an angry guy, right? So he comes out and he is not greeted right after the banquet, right after listening to Esther make her request. He comes out and he's not greeted by Mordecai getting down and honoring him. And he's furious. And so he goes home angry. He maintains his composure in that moment, but he goes home angry. And then secondly, he starts boasting to his family. I mean, these people, they already know this. Like, look at how important I am. I've got 10 kids. I've got all this wealth, right? I've been promoted by the king to the highest position. And not only that, but I've been invited by Queen Vastia to a banquet. And not only once, but I'm getting invited back tomorrow night. I'm like, I am super cool, right? I'm the most important guy next to the king in the kingdom. Boasting to his family and his friends. Which is probably where his anger comes from, right? His anger is rooted in his pride, which then leads to his third problem, his impetuousness. I mean, he just concludes that he is so good and so right that the king is just going to show favor. After all, he'd already gone to the king and said, hey, there's a bunch of people we need to get rid of. And the king said, go ahead, do it, right? So Haman is confident. His pride, his arrogance, his anger blinds him. Well, we don't know that yet. You have to read the next chapter. But this is where he's at. So he impetuously acts. He goes ahead and has these gallows built. And that's the end of the story. That's the end of chapter 5. Now, what do we do with this? How might this have anything to do with our lives today? I phrase it like this, just point of application well, first of all, statement, right? Next slide, we'll show this. Esther's plan, right? Esther's plan is rooted in righteous character. Esther's plan is rooted in righteous character and faith and trust in God. She has this godly dependence. Whereas Haman's plan is rooted in this wickedness, this wicked character, and utter self-dependency. These are two big ideas that you walk away from this passage with. Esther is righteous, Haman is wicked. Esther trusts in God, Haman trusts in himself. So I thought it would be appropriate to then kind of ask this next question. Who am I more like? Am I more like Haman or am I more like Esther? Is there more of Haman in me? Am I threatened when others don't appreciate me when I think they should? Do I want to have revenge when my pride is wounded? Do I act impetuously, rashly, quickly? Am I somebody who's self-dependent and not reliant upon God? I mean, I can find myself in there at times. How much of Esther's character is in me? Do I carry myself with dignity? I didn't comment on this, and this really isn't the place to have a big conversation, but it is interesting that clothing is mentioned here. How we dress does matter. That's why Esther dressed the way that she dressed. She knew it mattered. There's probably something to think about and to dig into that with, right? How I dress. Why do I dress the way that I dress? What is it that motivates the kind of dress that I choose? There's probably something there to dig into. That's for another thing. But how much of Esther's character is in me? Do I carry myself with dignity? Do I have humility? Am I willing to accept and to submit to those in authority, those above me, even when I don't like it, even when I don't like the rules, even when I don't like the decisions that might be being made? Can I submit? And by the way, the word submit doesn't mean to be forced down. It means to willfully choose, to willfully choose, to willfully choose to put yourself under. Am I like Esther in that I have humility? Am I like Esther in that I really trust in God? I appreciated Ryland's leadership this morning, and some of the things that he was talking about as he shared his own testimony and his own story, and how easy it is for us as people to trust in ourselves, right? To think through our own lens and to make choices in and of ourselves and to come to conclusions in and of ourselves, and whether it be a negative attitude about ourselves and that God will never accept me. This was Ryan's testimony, right? And so let's go to the next slide here. As we consider that nothing happens unless we make something happen, and yet when we make something happen, we cannot ensure something successful will happen. We need to do that in the context of the next slide, and that is in the context of Proverbs 3. This is a famous verse, but it needs to be thought through. And I'm going to ask our worship team, you guys come on up right now. Proverbs 3 says, trust in the Lord with all of your heart. I don't know what situation you might be in right now. I don't know if you're a high school senior and in front of you is big plans and big decisions that you need to make as some of our high school students come up. Don't trust in yourself. Yeah, you got to make a choice. And yeah, it's going to be risky and you won't know the outcome. But here's the idea. Esther trusted in God. It was risky for her. She didn't know what the outcome would be, but she trusted in God. Trust in the Lord, and don't lean on your own understanding. I mean, like in Esther's case, in her situation, her own understanding just led to this place of, I'm going to die because I'm breaking the law and the king will take my life. And in Haman's place, Haman was so full of anger and rage and so full of self-pride that he was absolutely certain of his success. He trusted in himself. He leaned on his own understanding. But in all of our ways, let's be people who acknowledge God, who literally just kind of live. I mean, I think this body posture is helpful to me when I just put out my hands and just say, God. I found myself last night awake, wrestling with stuff for way too long. And then it was this sermon that was going through my mind, and then it was this verse. And actually, I fell asleep praying this verse. Trust in God. I can't figure it all out. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't have the answers. Yeah, I got to make a plan. But I can't lean on my own understanding because all I see and know is that much. And then eventually I have to make the choice, take the risk, and move forward. Church, stand and let's sing this last song together.
Let's lift up our voices to Him. In Christ alone, my hope is found. He is my light, my strength, my song. This cornerstone, this solid ground, firm through the fiercest drought and storm. What heights of love, what depths of peace, when fears are stilled, when striving cease, my comforter, my all in all, here in the love of Christ I
Fullness of God in helpless me.
As we end, I ask that you kind of quickly go out the doors. There's a medical emergency over here in the corner. I'm not certain of all the details, but let's just please exit. Oh, it's over here. So we need to exit this way to give space, please.